I'm not saying I peaked, but for 3 glorious days in early December, my house was basically the North Pole's slightly flashier cousin. 30,000 LEDs. Seriously, if NASA had pointed the Hubble telescope at my cul-de-sac, they would have found my house first. The lawn looked less like grass and more like a carefully manicured supernova. I even timed the flicker of the icicle lights to the bass drop in a certain holiday EDM remix. It was, objectively, perfection. Then, bam, the notification of my impending doom, or at least my impending fine, arrived. The letter smelled faintly of passive aggression and stale, moth-eaten potpourri. It was one of those thick, cream-colored envelopes, the kind that screams, "We have too much time on our hands, and we will use it to regulate your holiday joy." It was a cease and desist for my festive radiance, claiming my display was a verifiable navigational hazard, among other utterly ridiculous things. Navigational hazard? I'm in a cul-de-sac in suburban Ohio, about 400 miles from the nearest major air traffic control center, not directing transatlantic jets at LAX. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, specifically its president, Agnes. She had another thing coming. This was now a war of attrition, and my arsenal included enough extension cords to stretch from here to that perpetually unhappy look on Agnes's face. My name is Ethan, and my life in Willow Creek, USA is usually pretty great. I've got the kind of house that suggests responsible adulthood, a job that lets me work remotely, a blessing and a curse, let me tell you, and an unparalleled enthusiasm for holidays, especially Christmas. I don't just put up lights, I architect them, I engineer them, I turn my home into a monument to cheer, and usually the neighbors love it, except for Agnes. Agnes is the reason they invented the word killjoy. She's been running the HOA like a tiny, tyrannical dictator since 2008, armed with a laminated copy of the bylaws and a permanent scowl. I've had minor skirmishes with her before. There was the great mailbox color debate of 2018. She wanted fawn beige. I opted for midnight blue, which she called aggressively non-compliant. And don't even get me started on the flamingo incident. I received a $50 fine for having a bright pink plastic flamingo in my yard past Memorial Day. The bylaw, which she had apparently written herself in cursive, stated, "Seasonal decorative fauna shall not be displayed outside its specific holiday context." That pink thing was merely waiting for its next deployment in a backyard luau, but Agnes, clutching her clipboard, declared it out of season, like it was a summer blockbuster that had overstayed its welcome. She's relentless. But this year's light display was different. It was my magnum opus. I dedicated a whole weekend to it. My house looked like a resort for retired electrical engineers. We were talking 1.21 gigawatts of holiday cheer. Every shingle, every gutter, every bush was accounted for. I used purely cool white lights to achieve that stunning, icy brilliance. When I flicked the switch for the first time, I swear a dog barked 3 counties over and then immediately stopped, blinded by the sheer festive intensity. It was gorgeous, breathtaking, and slightly illegal, if Agnes had anything to say about it. I tore open the cream-colored envelope. It wasn't just a violation. It was a doctoral thesis on why I was a menace to the entire subdivision. I'm going to share a list because lists are the only way to process this kind of bureaucratic insanity. Light spectrum violation. The light emanating from the property is determined to be outside the acceptable visual spectrum, 400-700 nanometers, due to excessive saturation and intensity, causing visual distress. I guess they measured the actual light waves. That's dedication. Luminosity. Overage, 400% of allowed lux. The measured brightness exceeds the permitted limit by a factor of 4, posing a threat to local wildlife and driver safety. My lights were so bright, they were upsetting the squirrels. Undue festivity. The excessive number of illumination units creates an impression of garishness that detracts from the uniform aesthetic of Willow Creek. This one was my favorite. They fined me for being too happy. Energy consumption. Concern. The electrical usage associated with the display is presumed to place an undue burden on the community's shared infrastructure. They were worried about my power bill. The letter demanded immediate, substantial dimming within 48 hours, or a fine of $100 per day would commence. My immediate, sarcastic internal monologue was deafening. Comply? Me? Agnes was asking me to dim the very essence of my holiday spirit. That's like asking a star to stop being so shiny. This wasn't about lights. This was about control. This was about a woman who wore orthopedic shoes and demanded that everyone else's life be as beige as her landscaping mulch. I looked at my brilliant, beautiful, blinding display, and then at the hateful letter. The lights pulsed softly. They seemed to be daring me. Do it, Ethan. Fight back. The initial decision was made in a microsecond. Agnes has another thing coming. I grabbed a pen. I wrote, "Not a chance, Agnes," on the corner of the letter, circled the $100 fine, and then carefully, meticulously, placed the envelope back on my counter. The war was officially on. The first phase of my retaliation would be subtle, technical, and involve more wattage. My first attempts at compliance were utterly pathetic, but hilarious to me, which is what matters. The deadline was looming, and I knew Agnes would be staking out my house like a particularly aggressive Christmas Grinch. I tried putting a small, strategically ripped piece of brown grocery bag paper over one of the 30,000 bulbs, just enough to look like I'd made an effort. I figured, if they fine me for non-compliance, I can argue that I did comply, just minimally. The result? It just made that one bulb look like it was wearing a tiny, ill-fitting hat. The other 29 to 999 LEDs laughed at it. Next, I thought about dimming. I went out and smeared a thin layer of mud, organic, non-compliant mud probably, over the central control box's dimmer setting. The display looked less brilliant and more sickly yellow. It was depressing. It looked like the lights had caught a nasty winter cold. I couldn't live like that. I quickly wiped the mud off, restored the display to its full, glorious, blinding power, and instantly felt better. Sure enough, a second letter arrived the next afternoon. It was thinner, sharper, and used the word egregious twice. It also featured a tiny, blurry photo of my house at night, annotated with 3 angry red arrows pointing at my brightest bushes. The daily fine was now $200, retroactive to the original deadline. "Oh, Agnes," I muttered to the icicle lights, which pulsed in response like they were cheering me on. "You think you can out-escalate me? You don't even know what escalation is." I decided that if my lights were causing a problem, the problem wasn't the lights, it was the power supply. I needed to ensure I was drawing the absolute maximum current possible without tripping the entire subdivision into darkness, which, while tempting, would be too much trouble. I needed an expert. I needed a contractor. I called Sal, an electrician I'd used for years, a guy who knew his way around a fuse box and also around a highly illegal but satisfyingly large draw of power. Sal showed up in his beat-up van, looking like a man who had seen too many frayed wires and too many irrational homeowners. He was wearing overalls and a look of deep professional skepticism. "Ethan," he said, not even looking at the lights. "When you said an issue with your holiday display, I thought maybe a fuse was blown. This looks like a regional airport." "Thanks, Sal. High praise," I said, beaming. "Look, I have a problem, but it's not electrical. It's organizational. The HOA thinks my lights are too bright. They measured the lux, apparently. They're fining me." Sal squinted at the house. "Too bright? That's not a thing. You're within code for home occupancy, even if you're bending the limits of good taste." "Exactly. But the HOA bylaws are like a shadowy parallel legal system. So I need your expertise. I need you to ensure that the display is running at the absolute, technical, legal, maximum current draw for my service line. I want to know, down to the last ampere, how much power I can legally suck out of this grid before I risk setting the street on fire." Sal leaned against my front porch railing, pulling a cigarette out of his shirt pocket. He looked tired. "Look, buddy, I can light up your house like the surface of the sun," he sighed, lighting up. "I can run a temporary service line just for your lawn decorations if you want to spend the cash. But the HOA? Those people never lose. They live for this kind of pettiness. You put up more lights, they just write bigger fines. It's a bureaucracy, Ethan. You can't win." "You're thinking too small, Sal. I'm not putting up more lights. I'm thinking about reluminosity. I just need to make sure this current configuration is running at peak capacity, just in case, say, I decide to power something else." He shook his head, a wry smile finally cracking his professional exterior. "You're nuts. Fine. I'll check the panel. For the record, running this much wattage through household extensions is a terrible idea. I'm going to run a temporary dedicated feeder line just for these things. We'll call it the seasonal festive load. It'll be safe. It'll also cost you." "Money is no object when fighting tyranny, Sal," I declared dramatically. "It always is," he grumbled, disappearing around the corner with his toolkit. An hour later, he emerged. "Okay, the seasonal festive load is good to go. You're drawing about 80 amps, which is almost certainly the maximum you can pull without triggering a brownout down the block. Your lights are officially as bright as they can possibly be. Any brighter, and the local utility guys will show up." "Perfect. You're a genius, Sal. Just bill me." I paid Sal, watched my house glowing with its new, officially maximal wattage, and felt a brief, satisfying sense of victory. Then I remembered Agnes. This was just a technical adjustment. It didn't solve the problem. It just made the problem legally compliant on my end. Agnes would just look up and write a fine for aesthetic affront to the community charter. I sat on my porch, defeated, contemplating my next move. I looked at the letter, at the house, then up at the dark, cold night sky. A small commuter jet flew over, leaving a faint white contrail high up against the blackness. That's when it hit me. A moment of pure, blinding, retaliatory genius. I asked myself the ultimate rhetorical question. What's bigger than my house? The sky. What's brighter than my LEDs? Nothing. But publicity is a close second, right? The HOA regulates ground-level aesthetics. They regulate paint, fences, shrubbery, and holiday lights on my property. They cannot, however, regulate the troposphere. The sky was the limit, and I was about to rent the limit for 8 hours. The next day was a blur of frantic, highly inappropriate Google searches. I was on a mission. The whole concept was so ridiculously petty, so ludicrously expensive, and so utterly perfect that I couldn't stop grinning. My search history must have looked like a manifesto for a supervillain specializing in community relations. Legal loopholes for aerial light pollution? 0 results, thankfully. How to? Annoy your HOA from space. Mostly joke articles, but one helpful link. Cost of continuous skywriting. Terrifying results, but I clicked anyway. Air traffic control rules for festive aerial displays. Surprisingly specific. I quickly zeroed in on the profession. Skywriting. It was retro, it was visible, and most importantly, it was mobile. It wasn't permanently affixed to my property, so it fell outside the HOA's jurisdiction. It was technically commercial advertising. What I intended to advertise, however, was highly debatable. After 3 hours of calling around and hearing a lot of incredulous laughter, I finally connected with Ace Rodriguez, a pilot running a small aerial advertising business out of a regional airstrip about 50 miles away. Ace sounded exactly like a man who spent his life 5,000 feet above the earth, slightly detached, mildly bored, and totally professional. Until I told him the request. Sky High Adverts, Ace speaking. What can we write for you today? Ace, I need a job done. A big job. A continuous 8-hour repeating message over a residential area. A long pause. I could hear the faint static of a radio in the background. 8 hours? Son, we usually write a proposal, circle back, and that's maybe 2 hours max, allowing for refuel. 8 hours is a lot of sky, and a lot of smoke fluid. What's the message? I took a deep breath. It's a holiday greeting. I wanted to say, Happy Holidays, Agnes, your bright neighbor. The pause this time was longer. I swear I heard him cough to cover a laugh. Agnes? Is that your wife, son? Because this sounds like a very expensive way to apologize. It's the president of my homeowners association, Ace. She fined me for my Christmas lights being too bright. I need this message to start promptly at 8 o'clock a.m. and run until 4 o'clock p.m., circling continuously over the Willow Creek subdivision. We can repeat the message every time we complete the loop. Ace whistled softly. 8 hours. That's like 3 times the length of Titanic, flying non-stop. We'd have to use the Super Stearman. It's got the extended fuel tanks, but even then, that's 3 trips. Pilot change, fluid top off. We'd be a busy operation. That's going to be significant. He threw out a number that made my eyes water. It was enough to buy a small, used car, maybe a slightly bigger, new set of decorative lights. I didn't even flinch. Done. Money is no object when fighting tyranny, Ace. Consider it a long-term investment in neighborhood freedom. I need maximum visibility. It needs to be clear, clean, and utterly impossible to ignore. I want Agnes to look up, see that message, and know that her petty bureaucracy has been defeated by physics and my checking account. You're telling me you're spending 5 figures because a lady told you to turn off your Christmas lights? He asked, a touch of admiration in his voice. Ace, I'm paying 5 figures because that lady used the phrase undue festivity in an official HOA communique. That is unforgivable. This is not just a greeting, it's a protest art installation. A magnificent 8-hour-long smoky middle finger to municipal overreach. Is that a problem for you? Ace laughed, a full booming sound that sounded like a propeller starting up. Son, that's not a problem. That's poetry. I'll draft the contract. We'll need half up front. We'll call it the Operation Bright Neighbor. Weather permitting, we can launch on Saturday. The contract arrived via email, looking totally legitimate, despite the ridiculousness of the mission. I signed it immediately. It felt deeply satisfying, signing a professional contract to commit an act of utterly juvenile suburban revenge. In the days leading up to the launch, I was a wreck. I kept looking at the sky, checking the wind speed on my phone. The thrill and anxiety were building. I was pacing around my living room like a caged animal. What if the plane broke down? What if they wrote the wrong name? What if they wrote, "Agnes is right. Your lights are too bright"? Was this crazy? Probably, I asked the festive, aggressively bright Santa in my window. Was it brilliant? Absolutely. I knew the stakes. If this failed, the money would be gone, and Agnes would declare total victory, probably erecting a permanent monument to her triumph in the community green space. If it succeeded, I would become a legend. The legend of the Light Lord. The night before, I set my alarm for 7:30 a.m., checked the weather. Clear skies, minimal wind, perfect conditions for maximum public humiliation, and went to bed. I drifted off to sleep, dreaming of the faint smell of engine exhaust and the sight of gigantic letters hanging in the sky. Saturday morning dawned crisp, cold, and clear. Ideal viewing conditions. I was up at 7 o'clock a.m., my stomach churning with anticipation. I made myself a large mug of coffee, spiked with a generous amount of eggnog, naturally, and settled into my living room chair, which I treated like the command center for Operation Bright Neighbor. I watched the clock tick to 8 o'clock a.m. This is it. Right on the dot, I heard it. The distant, unmistakable drone of a piston engine. It grew louder, moving purposefully from the east. It wasn't the sound of commercial air travel. It was the sound of professional, high-powered, incredibly petty revenge. I dashed outside onto my front porch. And there he was. Ace. High up, maybe 7,000 feet, the little plane banked, and the first white plume of vapor was released. It was a masterpiece of aerial choreography. The initial H of happy was massive, dwarfing the houses below. The air smelled faintly of oil and determination. The skywriting started. It took Ace about 15 minutes to complete the initial message. "Happy holidays, Agnes. Your bright neighbor." The letters were enormous, hanging perfectly still in this. The calm morning air, white against the deep blue. You could read it from 3 miles away. The neighbors' reactions were immediate and priceless. I saw Mrs. Higgins, 2 doors down, come out to retrieve her newspaper. She looked up, froze mid-step, and dropped her whole bag of organic kale onto the driveway. She just stood there, staring at the sky with her mouth agape. Mr. Peterson, the retired accountant, walked out in his robe, shading his eyes. He shook his head slowly, walked back inside, and emerged seconds later holding a pair of binoculars. He was scrutinizing the punctuation. Even he couldn't hate the spectacle. I watched as cars drove by, slowing to a crawl. People were pointing, laughing, taking pictures. The message was already trending on the neighborhood Facebook group under a new thread titled, "Did Ethan finally lose it? Or is this the greatest day of our HOA lives?" Around 9:30 a.m., Agnes and 2 grim-faced board members, Martha and Bill, both equally humorless, assembled on the sidewalk across the street. Their faces were redder than a Christmas ornament. Agnes was clutching her clipboard like a shield. She looked physically ill, staring up at the giant, looping message that addressed her by name. I waved. "Merry Christmas, Agnes. Great viewing day." She ignored me, speaking urgently into a cell phone, presumably to her HOA lawyer. She looked utterly defeated, yet simultaneously radiating the kind of furious energy that could power a small city. I continued to sit on my porch, sipping eggnog, wearing a massive grin, treating the entire front yard like my private movie theater. The plane finished a loop, banked, and started writing the message again, ensuring a fresh, bold rendition was always floating over the neighborhood. Around 10:45 a.m., the inevitable happened. 2 patrol cars from the Willow Creek Police Department pulled up discreetly near Agnes's gathering. This was the moment of truth. Officer Miller, a tall, young cop who looked like he'd rather be directing traffic at a football game, approached me cautiously. His partner stayed by the car, trying and failing to suppress a smile while looking up at the sky. "Sir, are you Mr. Ethan Baker?" "That would be me, officer. Happy holidays. My lights look great today, don't they?" Officer Miller ran a hand over his crew cut. "Sir, I have a complaint here, filed by the Homeowners Association, citing you for disturbing the peace and possibly air traffic endangerment due to what they are calling a sustained aerial smoke spectacle." He looked up at the sky, where the phrase "Happy Holidays" was clearly visible for the 3rd time. He sighed, looking thoroughly confused. "Can you explain why a plane has been drawing a giant candy cane and a personalized holiday greeting over your house for nearly 3 hours?" I stood up, adjusting my festive wool sweater. I adopted my most calm, professional, and slightly sarcastic tone. "Officer, with all due respect, I can explain it easily. I hired an FAA-certified commercial advertising pilot under contract to display a holiday greeting that includes my neighbor's name. It's commercial speech. It's no different than a banner tow or a blimp, only far more aesthetically pleasing. Is it obstructing air traffic? No. Is it rude? I submit that the message is quite polite. It says, 'Happy Holidays.' And finally, is it against the law to have really big holiday spirit?" Officer Miller frowned, pulling out his notebook and looking back at the hysterical, gesticulating Agnes across the street. He looked at his partner, who shrugged, still looking amused. "The complaint says it's harassment, sir, targeted at Ms. Agnes Reynolds." "I'm happy to address that, officer. The HOA fined me for my lights being too bright, on my property. The plane is not on my property. The message is merely an advertisement for my brightly lit holiday display, which I believe is my right to advertise. I am merely following their mandate that my lights be less noticeable. I have placed the notice in the sky, where the HOA does not have jurisdiction. This is a matter of property rights and advertising law, not a criminal matter." I gave him my best, most innocent smile. The cop just stared at me, then at the sky, then at Agnes. He was caught between bureaucracy and absurdity was winning. "Sir," he finally said, defeated, "I can't issue a citation for commercial holiday greeting. If the pilot is following FAA rules and isn't flying dangerously, there's nothing for us to do. Just maybe next year, stick to tinsel, okay?" I watched him go, reporting his findings to Agnes, who looked ready to explode like a badly wired Christmas tree. The plane kept writing. The hours dragged on. The smoke message seemed to hang in the air like a taunt. Finally, at 4:00 p.m., precisely 8 hours after he started, Ace finished his last, magnificent, smoke-filled exclamation point. The engine noise faded into the distance. The sky was silent, save for the faint sounds of bewildered neighbors. I had done it. I had used an aerial contractor to circumvent a petty HOA rule for 8 glorious hours. Agnes slammed her car door. She didn't win this round, but the look on her face told me she was going to the HOA lawyer right now. This was far from over. The day after Operation Bright Neighbor was quiet, almost eerily so. The smoke had completely dissipated, leaving the sky clean, but the memory was indelible. My house still glowed at full, maximal wattage, a defiant, crystalline monument to my victory. The town's verdict was swift and decisive. I had become a folk hero. On the neighborhood Facebook group, the thread was exploding. Mrs. Higgins. I'm still stunned, but I have to admit it was the most excitement we've had since the 4th of July fireworks show. Go Ethan, a new account. Anonymous neighbor. I heard Agnes got so mad she ripped up her entire rhododendron bush. Ethan is a legend. I strongly suspected this was Sal, the electrician. Mr. Peterson. Technically, the aerial display was in violation of the neighborhood's visual noise ordinance, but I respect the chutzpah, 810 for execution. A few neighbors, mostly Agnes's loyalists, shunned me, crossing the street to avoid my house. But the majority, the people who had quietly suffered under the tyranny of beige paint and strict shrubbery height, applauded me. I received a surprisingly positive review on the neighborhood Google page. Best Christmas lights in Ohio. Management is a little overly dramatic, but they fight for their art. I was victorious, but I knew the fight was just moving indoors. The final showdown was scheduled for the emergency HOA meeting on Tuesday night. I attended, dressed in my most respectable suit, the one I usually reserved for weddings and tax audits. I was ready for battle. The meeting was held in the poorly lit, oppressively beige community center. Agnes sat at the head of the table, flanked by her 2 cohorts, Martha and Bill, all 3 looking like they had sucked on 3 lemons simultaneously. There were about 30 neighbors present, many of whom gave me a silent, encouraging nod. Agnes cleared her throat, adjusting her reading glasses with a theatrical flourish. She looked directly at me. Mr. Baker, she began, her voice quivering with controlled rage. We are here tonight to address your egregious violation of the Willow Creek Community Covenants, specifically the deliberate, sustained, and highly offensive act of harassment carried out via a private aircraft this past Saturday. She proceeded to levy a fine so massive it could finance a small city's annual budget, a combination of the $200 per day light fine, a $5,000 community harassment fee, and a $10,000 aerial nuisance penalty. I calmly stood up. Thank you, Agnes. I have a brief rebuttal. I pulled out my paperwork. I had actually hired a lawyer friend, Brenda, for a single hour to draft this defense. Money well spent. I would like to focus on 3 key points. First, the original light display. I retained a professional electrician who installed a dedicated line to ensure my display complies with all local and state electrical codes. The lights are now at their legal, technical maximum. Second, the issue of harassment. The message stated, "Happy holidays, Agnes, your bright neighbor." That is a pleasant, seasonal greeting, not a threat. There is no legal precedent for fining someone for a polite, if oversized, holiday greeting. I paused for dramatic effect, then hit them with the legal kill shot. And third, the $10,000 aerial nuisance penalty. I submit that the plane, Ace Rodriguez's Super Steerman, was conducting a commercial advertising service for which I paid a substantial fee. The FAA regulates the skies, not the Willow Creek HOA. I am merely exercising my right to free speech and commercial advertisement, which, incidentally, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled is protected. I looked directly at the board, pulling Brenda's memo. Furthermore, I direct your attention to Section 4, subsection B of the Willow Creek Community Charter, which limits signage on the property to 5 square feet. I ask you, Agnes, did I display any signage on my property? No. You said my lights were too bright. Did you specify where those lights or where my associated advertising couldn't be located? Did you? Agnes sputtered. It was implicit. It was clearly intended to circumvent the spirit of the law. Ah, but law, Agnes, deals in facts, not spirit, I said, quoting Brenda. The facts are that your covenant does not regulate the airspace above our homes, and since the plane was advertising my legally compliant, though maximal, light display, I believe the penalty is invalid. A neighbor in the back started to clap. The board members exchanged terrified glances. They knew I had them. They couldn't afford to fight an expensive lawsuit based on the FAA and the First Amendment. After a tense, 15-minute closed-door session that sounded like a catfight in a barrel, the HOA emerged. Agnes, defeated but still rigid, read the resolution through gritted teeth. The board has decided to dismiss the community harassment and aerial nuisance fees, citing insufficient legal standing. However, the original fine for the lights, at $200 per day for 7 days, totaling $1,400, stands, due to the display's continuation after the initial notice. I smiled and nodded. A $1,400 fine was a painful sting, but a Pyrrhic victory for Agnes. The cost of the fine was a fraction of the cost of the plane, but I had paid a small price to win the greater war. I would be paying for the lights and the plane for months. But the memory? Priceless. I paid the fine immediately, making sure to drop the check directly into Agnes's hand. I was exhausted, financially drained, but utterly, profoundly victorious. I had spent a considerable amount of money to avoid turning off a few light bulbs, but I had shown the entire neighborhood that the spirit of joy and nonconformity could not be regulated by a committee and a clipboard. As I walked out of the community center, the cold air hitting my face, I looked back at my glowing house. The bright, relentless LEDs looked less like decorations and more like the eternal flame of rebellion. I packed away the lights a few weeks later. The season was over, but the smoke message had left a permanent impression on Willow Creek. I became the legend of the Light Lord, the guy who dared to fight the HOA not with a lawyer, but with an aircraft. I'm not gonna lie, I loved the skywriting. But next year, I'm thinking drones, thousands of them, forming Agnes's face in the night sky and making it wink every 30 seconds. Gotta keep 'em guessing, right? And maybe this time I'll advertise a car wash instead of my holiday cheer. Tax deduction.